The sun scorched down on Main Street like a punishment nobody had earned. But everyone endured. It was one of those Mississippi days where the air hung heavy, syrup thick and slow, and the asphalt threatened to melt beneath every step. Main Street stretched wide, lined with flower beds that wilted no matter how often the town's Rotary Club watered them, and storefronts with painted signs chipped by time. From the coffee shop on the corner, jazz murmured from an old speaker that always sounded like it had secrets. Life drifted through that street in steady rhythm. Kids chased each other around a hydrant. A man loaded his truck with sacks of feed. A local pastor nodded to a woman locking her pharmacy door. But on that particular Thursday, no one expected a rupture. A moment sharp enough to slice through the heat and turn memory permanent. Naomi Trent walked with a quiet certainty that defied the sluggish day. She was dressed simply, a charcoal gray sheath dress, an oversized denim jacket thrown over her shoulders like armor for a war no one could name. She wasn't remarkable at first glance, and perhaps that was the problem. She didn't look hurried, didn't look lost, didn't look like someone needing direction, and in towns like Stonefield, that could be a sin all its own. She crossed the street with the kind of poise that made people look twice, not because of flair or flash, but because she moved like she knew where she was going. And for Officer Dean Laskey, seated in his idling cruiser beneath the convenience store awning, that was enough. Dean Laskey had been called a lot of things in his 15 years on the force: decorated, dedicated, decisive, but never once had he been called into question. He carried himself with the bloated confidence of a man used to being obeyed. He liked to see the fear spark in people's eyes when his shadow touched them. His badge glinted under the windshield that day like a threat waiting to be spoken. When Naomi stepped into the crosswalk, he saw her not as a pedestrian, but as a disruption. No call came in. No description was given. Just a gut feeling, that old phrase the department used like a badge of honor, and a shield from scrutiny. He flicked on the siren for just a burst. A half-second of sound that split the street in two. Tires screeched as he pulled the cruiser sharply onto the curb, bumping up onto the sidewalk with the ease of entitlement. The jazz cut off. A woman dropped her iced tea. People turned. Some flinched. Others reached for their phones. Naomi didn't stop walking until he called out to her sharp, loud, meant to command. "Hey, you! Stop!" She paused mid-step, one foot just touching the shade of the drugstore's awning. She turned slowly, one hand brushing a lock of hair away from her cheek. Her expression was unreadable, calm, almost disinterested, and that was what set him off. Laskey approached with the gait of someone who believed the ground owed him stability. His hands hovered near his belt, not quite reaching for his weapon. Not quite resting, but enough to send a signal. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" he asked, his voice too loud, too tight. Naomi's gaze moved over him like a scan. Her reply came softly. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to cross a street." That was it. Nothing vulgar, nothing raised, no resistance, just the truth, said plainly. And in that instant, Officer Laskey's control slipped. Not because she defied him, but because she didn't. Because she saw him, saw through him, and didn't tremble. He couldn't find the usual crack to wedge his authority into, so he made one. "You have ID." She reached slowly, deliberately, for the wallet in her jacket. The gesture was measured, almost meditative. It made some people across the street tense up instinctively, afraid of what this man might do for no reason at all. "You mind telling me what this is about?" she asked. Not accusatory, but clear. He didn't answer. Not with words, His fist moved before thought, before logic, a snap of motion that cracked the thick heat like thunder. It landed hard against her cheek. The sound wasn't loud, but the silence that followed made it ring louder than a gunshot. A gasp swept the crowd. A toddler began to cry. Someone shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" But it came too late. The damage was done. Naomi staggered half a step, but didn't fall. Her head turned with the blow, hair shifting like silk across her jaw. And then she turned back. She looked at him. She looked at him. There was no scream, no tears, just the faint smear of blood growing in the corner of her mouth like an ink blot on a sacred page. She reached up and touched it, not dramatically, not to perform, just to acknowledge. A dark streak painted her fingertip. She examined it with the casual solemnity of someone checking the weather. Then she lifted her eyes and stared straight into Laskey's. That silence was the moment that broke Stonefield. Not the punch, not the blood, not even the disbelief, but the stillness. A black woman had just been assaulted, in daylight, on Main Street, for asking a question, and she stood like someone who had done this before, like someone who had been here, survived here, and wasn't the one shaking. No threats, no retaliation, just presence, just witness. And it terrified him, because Dean Laskey was trained for noise screams, chaos, resistance, but this was something else. A man holding groceries stepped out of the crosswalk and didn't know what to say. A teenager lifted his phone, shaking, unsure if filming made him a participant or a coward. A mail carrier stopped mid-delivery, letter hanging from his hand, staring like the scene was a photograph burning itself into memory. A dog barked once, then silence. Naomi didn't move toward Laskey, didn't shrink away. She just stood there, face stung, blood blooming, and her eyes fixed on him with a gravity so total it felt like the sun dimmed behind her. And that's when it started. People didn't rush to her. They didn't cry out. They just watched. Because in her silence, they heard something louder than sirens. The power of a woman who knew exactly what had happened, exactly what it meant, and had nothing left to prove. Her strength wasn't in resistance, it was in the refusal to collapse. Laskey muttered something, but it was incoherent. He stepped back slightly. Then he reached for his radio, voice shaking just enough to register to those who were listening closely. The bravado that once lived in his spine began to leak out slowly through the soles of his boots. Somewhere in the shadows of his mind, the question began to whisper, "Who is she?" But he would not find the answer that day. Not from her, not from anyone. Naomi Trent stood beneath the Mississippi sun, her blood on her fingers, her silence a blade sharper than steel. And Stonefield, for the first time in decades, held its breath. Because something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The moments that followed the punch didn't unravel in chaos the way one might expect after a public assault on a black woman by a white police officer. No crowd surged forward. No screams demanded justice. No sirens screamed backup. It was stranger than that. It was quiet, deep, unnatural quiet, as if the heat itself had thickened and pressed down on everyone's lungs. Naomi Trent remained motionless in the center of that stillness, her cheek marked with blood, her posture steady, and her eyes holding a silence that made people shift uncomfortably, unsure of what they had just witnessed, and even more unsure of what it meant. A punch had landed. Yet it was Dean Laskey who seemed to be bleeding something invisible control. confidence, the illusion of authority. It slipped from him the longer she stared, and the longer she didn't respond the way he needed her to. Her refusal to scream, cry, or crumble short-circuited something deep inside the crowd's collective programming. There was no permission in this silence, no narrative, only the raw, unfiltered tension of a town seeing itself clearly for the first time in years and not liking the view. Dean Laskey blinked, one hand still twitching near his belt. His eyes darted from Naomi to the bystanders, scanning for someone to support his next move, someone to nod and validate the lie he already wanted to tell. But no one nodded. No one moved. The people weren't confused, they were paralyzed, because what they had seen didn't fit in the categories they'd been fed. She hadn't been dangerous. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't raised her voice. And yet the image was undeniable. A black woman, bloodied and still, assaulted without provocation. And the man who did it, now trembling in uniform, unsure of what to do with a world that no longer obeyed the rules he thought were his to write. Naomi finally spoke, but it wasn't to the officer or to the crowd. It was to herself, or maybe to history. Just one soft sentence, barely audible. It's always quiet, right before they remember. Then she turned, calmly, and stepped toward the patrol car with the kind of dignity that made every inch of her stride feel like a sermon. She opened the back door herself and waited. Not a single camera clicked. Not a single word of protest escaped the crowd. It wasn't submission. It was shock. No one knew whether they were watching an arrest, an escort, or an exodus. Dean followed her, handcuffs still clinking uselessly at his side, and for the first time in his career, he didn't give an order. He simply got in the car. The cruiser door shut like a church door on a long-forgotten sin. The ride to the station was unbearable, not because of noise, but because of how utterly quiet it was. No radio chatter. No fumbled excuses. No breathing. It seemed, except for Naomi's slow, measured inhales, like she was cataloging the scent of guilt and stale authority that saturated the back seat. Dean Laskey drove like a man trying to remember how. His hands shook on the wheel just slightly, and his eyes darted toward the mirror more often than the road. She didn't look at him, didn't ask questions, and that lack of resistance only sharpened the blade twisting in his chest. His mind searched for logic, for training, for protocol. But the silence beside him defied all of it. He was used to escalation. He was used to screaming and struggling and the righteous echo of comply or else. But Naomi offered none of that. She gave him nothing, and it was that nothingness that began to gnaw at the corners of his certainty. When they arrived at the precinct, the air changed. Laskey expected the usual rhythm, the subtle straightening of spines when he walked through. The grunted greetings, the unspoken respect due a seasoned officer who kept the town in line. But as Naomi stepped from the car before anyone reached to open the door for her, everything froze. She moved like someone returning to a place she had already mapped in dreams and nightmares. Each step quiet, but impossibly heavy, like her soul's remembered weight the rest of the world tried to forget. Officers paused in doorways. A dispatcher hung up mid-sentence, and as she crossed the threshold of the station, it was clear that she wasn't just entering a building, she was disrupting its gravity. Laskey trailed behind, reduced now to a shadow. Something in him hesitated to touch her. He told himself it was caution, professionalism. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. He was afraid of her stillness, of her silence, of what he didn't know, Because something about Naomi Trent didn't move like an ordinary civilian. Something about her posture suggested history. Not personal history, but institutional. The kind that made bureaucracies tremble when they saw their own secrets reflected in a pair of unblinking eyes. At the intake desk, Officer Darnell nodded at Laskey and reached for the logbook. "Name," he asked casually, without looking up. Naomi's voice was steady, even. "Trent. Naomi Elise." Darnell typed with the usual mechanical rhythm, glancing up at her ID. Then he froze. A beep. Then another. The screen flickered just once. Then came the override. Classified Directive 44.9, PHX clearance. Return to Central Command. Do not engage. Level red. Everything stopped. No one in that station had ever seen a clearance tag that high. Not in real time. Not without a warning. Not in this town. The kind of directive that didn't come from the state, or even the federal government, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that didn't exist on any flowchart they were trained to recognize. Officer Darnell leaned back slowly in his chair, his mouth dry. The message stayed on screen, flashing crimson, pulsing like a heartbeat from an invisible power. Dean Laskey stepped forward, mouth open to object, or clarify, or cover. But nothing came out, not a word. A senior lieutenant stepped into the room, his face pale. He stared at the screen, then at Naomi. "You're PHX," he whispered, though the silence made it sound like a scream. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. The warning had already told them everything. Return to Central Command. Do not engage. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, one that outranked everyone in the building. Every badge, every protocol, every shred of power Dean Laskey once believed in. The air changed again, now heavier, electric, the kind of weight that made grown men remember old regrets. Naomi's presence wasn't just confusing anymore, it was destabilizing. She didn't smirk. She didn't glare. She didn't speak again. She simply turned, walked past the intake desk, and sat down on the bench without asking permission. Her blood had dried now, a small mark on her cheek, like an afterthought of pain that never had a chance to flourish. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. The silence in the room was suffocating. And in that silence, a different question bloomed, not just for Laskey, but for everyone within earshot of that screen. Who is she? The silence held them, not as a void, but as a mirror. And what they saw wasn't a woman out of place. What they saw was the evidence of something they were never trained to handle: power that didn't need permission. The crimson warning had barely faded from the station's screen when the real unraveling began, not through panic or confrontation, but through whispers. Browser tabs opened quietly, and cold sweats that crept up the backs of necks in government offices far beyond Stonefield. The name Naomi Trent began appearing in classified channels and restricted databases. Names like hers don't exist on public rosters. And when they do, it's because someone, somewhere, failed to hit delete. She hadn't spoken a word since the directive appeared. But that was exactly what made her more dangerous than anyone in that room could comprehend. People like Naomi didn't need to shout. They were trained to collapse entire networks with silence. Her name hadn't been uttered in any operational briefings for over 8 years. Not because she was gone, but because she had been filed away, beneath red tape, beneath strategic reports, beneath memory, buried, like a pressure point no one wanted to press again. Not until someone, Dean Laskey, did exactly that. And now the system was bracing for a rupture. The story of Naomi Trent wasn't one they told in training manuals. It lived in whispered lore across psychological operations units and deep state conference rooms. Officially, she had once been part of the Department of Strategic Response, under a division so deep and so untraceable it went by many names, depending on who was asking and who needed to be protected. But those who knew called it Unit Blacklight. 8 operatives, no public records, no photos. Just a code name and a clearance level that made federal marshals step aside without making eye contact. They weren't assassins or spies. They were something worse, something quieter. Their weapons weren't guns or knives, but words, presence, and the ability to unravel the human mind without ever touching it. Naomi had been the best. She didn't graduate from any academy with honors or trophies. She didn't publish a dissertation or top a psychological evaluation. What marked her wasn't what she said in interviews, but what she didn't. She had a calm about her stillness. They had called it, but it was a stillness that made even seasoned interrogators sweat through their suits. They brought her into blacklight because in a world that needed obedience, she could find the exact word that made obedience turn into doubt. She could walk into a negotiation and make a general change sides without realizing he'd done it. She could sit across from a warlord and say nothing until he confessed to things even his closest aides didn't know. Not because she demanded truth, but because her silence made lies collapse under their own weight. But 8 years ago, Naomi Trent vanished. She left no forwarding contact, no resignation letter, no trail of missed payments or expired IDs. Most believed she'd been reassigned, deep undercover, or quietly buried under one of the system's more permanent forms of disappearance. But the truth was stranger. She had walked away, not out of defiance, not out of fear, but because she had realized something that none of her superiors wanted to admit. The system didn't need more control, it needed witnesses. Not enforcers, not analysts, witnesses. People who would see the rot beneath the mission and remember what it felt like before the machine became more important than the people it claimed to protect. And so, Naomi Trent did the unthinkable. She chose to be forgotten. She moved to Stonefield, a town no one ever looked at twice. She enrolled as a civilian. She filed papers like everyone else. She paid rent in cash and filed taxes on time. She took a job as a special education teacher at West Pine Elementary, where the hallways always smelled faintly of crayons and mildew. And no one ever questioned why she knew sign language, Braille, and advanced conflict de-escalation methods. Her classroom was quiet, almost sacred. Children who couldn't sit still for more than 3 minutes in other rooms would spend full hours with Naomi, spellbound by her voice or the absence of it. Parents called her a miracle. Administrators called her efficient. The system didn't call her at all, because in their files, she didn't exist. Every report she filed was perfect. Not just tidy perfect. Flawless formatting, crisp grammar. Receipts matched to the cent. Dates chronologically aligned down to the minute. No one looked deeper because perfection doesn't raise red flags. It lulls you, makes you trust, every month. Naomi submitted her forms every month. The district office processed them without question, because the only thing more invisible than chaos is calm competence, especially when it wears a soft voice and a neat signature. But Naomi wasn't hiding. She was watching. She attended board meetings and never spoke. She joined parent-teacher associations and volunteered for cleanup duty. She never missed a fire drill, and though she walked through the same doors as every other teacher, her eyes never stopped measuring the walls, counting exits, observing behavior. noticing whose voice went unheard in a staff meeting, whose car lingered too long outside the school gates. Stonefield didn't know it, but it had been under surveillance for 8 years, not by drones, not by wiretaps, but by a woman who refused to unsee what she had once seen too much of. And for 8 years, nothing slipped until that Thursday, until a hot afternoon and a badge that thought it could dictate truth. Until Dean Laskey's gut feeling collided with a presence he could neither classify nor control. He didn't just punch a woman, he punched the wrong memory. A memory the system had spent years trying to suppress. And now, with one act of brutality, that memory was awake again. Inside the Department of Strategic Response, phones buzzed with encrypted updates. Someone at Langley retrieved a long decommissioned file labeled PHX-7 and found it still redacted top to bottom. But the clearance codes lit up anyway, causing protocol breaches in 3 separate departments. In an internal Slack thread of a think tank no one outside the Pentagon acknowledged. A question appeared: who let her disappear? No one replied. Meanwhile, back in Stonefield, Naomi sat in the holding room, calm and composed, like someone waiting for a train that was already late. Her fingers were folded in her lap. Her posture didn't shift. Not once. Officers passed by the glass wall and averted their eyes, not out of guilt, but because something about her presence made them forget their excuses. No yelling, no protests, no press conference. Just the undeniable truth that power does not always announce itself with sound. At West Pine Elementary, Principal Garvey pulled her personnel file out of curiosity. The address matched. The degrees were real. The references all valid. But a strange line at the bottom of the file caught his eye, transferred from Federated Education Division. Dept. 11C, Interim Civil Service Program. There was no such department, and the reference number linked to a defunct post office box in Virginia. He closed the folder and never mentioned it again. Parents began texting each other that night, wondering if Ms. Trent was okay. Not because they knew what had happened, but because something in the town's energy had shifted. A mother who had once confided in Naomi about her son's nightmares found herself crying in her car for no reason. A boy who never spoke began humming the melody Naomi used to play during sensory painting. The janitor walked past her empty classroom and paused, inexplicably, then turned off the light more gently than usual. Naomi Trent hadn't returned to blacklight. She never needed to, because blacklight had always been about control, and Naomi had learned something far more subversive. Presence doesn't require permission. And now that presence had returned still, unblinking, undeniable. And this time, she wasn't here to operate. She was here to be seen. It started with a single photo. No filters, no headline, just an image, uploaded by a shaky hand from a phone that had been half hidden in a purse during the incident. Naomi Trent, blood at the corner of her mouth, standing still in the middle of Main Street as Officer Dean Laskey towered inches away. His fist still half-clenched, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The photo captured no action, no fight, no aftermath, just a moment. But that moment contained volumes. Naomi's eyes weren't wide in fear. They weren't burning with rage. They were calm. Impossibly calm, staring through Laskey as though she were witnessing the weight of history pressing against a man who didn't know how much it was about to crush him. Her silence in that photo wasn't emptiness, it was a reckoning, and within hours, it began to move. At first, The image spread through group chats in Stonefield. People passed it along without knowing why they couldn't look away. It wasn't graphic. It wasn't even dramatic by traditional viral standards. But it stuck. Something in Naomi's face, the stillness, the clarity, the knowing reached people in a way no caption could. Then it hit the first major social platform. Someone tagged it. She didn't swing. She didn't run. She just stood. That post crossed 20,000 shares in an hour. A well-known educator with a national podcast retweeted it with just 3 words, "I recognize that look." And suddenly, the image wasn't just a photo, it was a mirror, one that refused to distort. By the next morning, the headlines hadn't caught up. But the people had. Teachers posted it during morning prep, saying they saw that same expression in students forced to explain their pain to administrators who'd already decided not to believe them. Nurses said it reminded them of patients of color dismissed in ERs while bleeding inside. A young man who once survived a traffic stop gone wrong wrote, "She's all of us who didn't get to speak before the system made up our minds for us." And then, someone named it. The Trent effect. It wasn't a campaign. It wasn't a movement. It was a disruption, the kind that didn't need organizers or slogans. Only the aching recognition of something long suppressed. The Trent effect wasn't about Naomi's silence. It was about the volume of what her silence revealed. Educators across the country began referencing her photo in trauma-informed teaching seminars. In one district in Chicago, a slide of her image was shown during teacher training under the title, "What We Miss When We Expect Compliance Over Understanding." At a city council meeting in Atlanta, an agenda item on community police relations was derailed when a councilwoman projected Naomi's photo on a screen and simply asked, "What do we say to our daughters when the calmest person in the room is the one bleeding?" The room fell so quiet. The clock ticking above the podium sounded like thunder. A motion to review police community funding passed immediately after, with no debate. But the system felt it most where it was weakest in its wallet. Law enforcement partnerships that once boasted gleaming corporate logos and cheerful hashtags began to falter. A major sponsor of the Stonefield Police Athletic League quietly pulled its funding. No press release, just a terse internal memo citing reputational risk. Within a week, 2 national retail chains withdrew support from their local police grants, citing an unfavorable public trust climate. The town's mayor tried to deflect during a press inquiry, calling it a routine review. But the silence from the corporate side was deafening. They weren't running from controversy. They were running from recognition. And then came the blog. It appeared anonymously, hosted on a site with no ads, no name. Just a stark, black header, "The woman who didn't need to speak." The first post wasn't journalism. It was confession. A teacher wrote about seeing Naomi at a staff meeting 3 years earlier, remembering how she sat quietly in the corner, never trying to speak over louder colleagues, yet somehow making them all listen more closely. A social worker submitted an entry about how a student once described Ms. Trent's classroom as the only place where my brain doesn't feel like it's on fire. The stories came in from everywhere: parents, janitors, bus drivers, even former classmates from years back who remembered Naomi's stillness as something sacred, not passive. The blog exploded. Within 72 hours, it passed 1 million reads, not because it was viral, but because it was undeniable. And yet, through it all, Naomi said nothing. She didn't go on TV. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't need to. Her absence became her presence. And the more people tried to place her into a category, they understood hero. Victim, leader, icon. the more she resisted every label simply by refusing to perform. The Trent effect worked not because Naomi called out the system, but because she made the system see itself in her reflection, and it recoiled. Dean Laskey's name began disappearing from official rosters. First, his bio was taken off the precinct website. Then he was placed on administrative reassignment. His police union issued a vague statement about conduct review, but it didn't land. People weren't angry, they were ashamed. Not just of what he did, but of how long it took for them to see the pattern. Stonefield's Facebook groups began sharing personal stories, moments when Laskey had warned someone for looking suspicious, or barked at a teen for crossing the street too slow, or parked just a little too long in front of certain houses without cause. Naomi didn't name these things. She didn't have to. She had already done the most radical thing a person like her could do. She had endured without permission, and stayed calm when the world demanded a scene. She offered no proof, no rebuttal, no spectacle, and in doing so, she shattered the system's addiction to noise. Back in Washington, the phrase Trent effect was uttered quietly in an internal memo at the Department of Homeland Security. The memo recommended that operatives in psychological sensitivity environments avoid engaging with media content related to the Trent incident, citing elevated emotional recursion and identity dissonance. In other words, the image of Naomi Trent was disrupting more than conversation. It was disrupting belief. 1 week after the photo leaked, a slide appeared in a virtual seminar for police cadets across 3 states. No title, no explanation, just the image of Naomi standing in the street. Blood on her face, gaze steady. Underneath it, a single line. What do you do when someone refuses to play the role you expect? Nobody answered. They just stared. A lieutenant from Missouri reportedly closed the training early, citing technical issues. But the cadets knew what really happened. The room had changed. They had seen something that no de-escalation manual could prepare them for, a presence so morally certain it exposed the absurdity of their tactics without saying a word. Elsewhere. In a quiet office in Stonefield Elementary, a guidance counselor placed a small printout of Naomi's photo in her desk drawer, not for show, but as a reminder. She began every morning by looking at it for 5 seconds, not out of reverence, but to remind herself what power could look like when it didn't perform. And in the streets, people began to walk differently. Teenagers lifted their chins a little higher when crossing intersections. A woman once berated by a store manager for being too aggressive simply looked him in the eye and said nothing until he left. A librarian moved Naomi's old lesson plans into a shared drive labeled Legacy Tools. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew the truth. Naomi Trent had changed the rules not by rewriting them, but by reminding everyone that silence is not the absence of force. Sometimes, it's the loudest verdict of all. It didn't happen all at once. That would have been easier: an arrest, a suspension, a press release condemning his actions, a clean severance from power. But that isn't how truth works when it claws its way through systems built on silence. Officer Dean Laskey didn't fall with a bang. He dissolved slowly, precisely, like a pillar eaten from within by time and termites. The first crack was so small he almost missed it. At the corner coffee shop where he'd ordered the same bitter dark roast for 10 years. The card reader buzzed and flashed red, declined. He laughed, brushing it off, muttering something about the bank. He reached into his wallet for a second card. But the barista college kid, pink hair, quiet eyes, just shook her head, not unkindly, and said, "We don't take cash anymore." Behind him, a man waiting for his order muttered under his breath, something barely audible but thick with judgment. Should have brought your badge instead." Dean left without his coffee. He hadn't even realized how quiet the shop had become until the door swung shut behind him and the noise returned whispers. Laughter. The low hum of espresso steaming. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a lot of things that day, but the silence had already begun to stretch behind him like a shadow that refused to stay still. At the station, things shifted from subtle to surgical. His desk wasn't touched, but the air around it changed. Colleagues who used to laugh too loud at his jokes now offered tight nods and busied themselves with phantom tasks. The morning banter disappeared. The chair next to him at roll call stayed empty deliberately. One by one, officers stopped tagging him in their posts. Group chats he once dominated grew quiet whenever his name appeared. The locker room, once his private kingdom of backslaps and ego, became an echo chamber where no one looked him in the eye. He tried to assert himself, asking pointed questions, offering commentary on patrol strategy, reminding the rookies of his record. But each word fell into a kind of invisible vacuum, like he was speaking underwater. No resistance, no confrontation, just the unbearable weight of being ignored. Then came the second card decline, this time at the gas station on Elm. Then the third, at his dry cleaner, where the woman behind the counter smiled tightly and handed his uniform back in a clear plastic bag with no receipt. "We didn't charge you," she said, voice too sweet. "Consider it taken care of." It wasn't kindness. It was severance. He tried posting on his social accounts, defending himself without saying what he was defending. Phrases like, "Don't believe everything you see," and "There's always more to the story" littered his feed. But they fell flat. The algorithms that once placed him at the top of local discussion boards now buried his words beneath recipes, lost dog alerts, and high school football scores. No likes, no replies. The same community that once celebrated him as tough but fair now scrolled past like he was digital static. People saw his posts the way they saw power lines in the distance, still standing, but no longer connected to anything. He filed a complaint with the precinct captain about the sudden cold shoulders. The captain listened, nodded, then asked for a moment to check something on his terminal. When he returned, his tone was flat. "According to the database, you are currently listed as pending transfer. No assignments scheduled." Dean blinked. Pending transfer to where the captain didn't answer. He didn't need to. Dean went home that night and stood in front of his bathroom mirror longer than usual. He looked the same pressed uniform, the same clipped hair, the same lined forehead. But something had shifted behind his eyes, a hollowness that hadn't been there before. He thought of Naomi. Not her voice, she hadn't raised it, not her actions, she hadn't moved, just her stare. That unbearable stillness, the kind that disassembles a man not by challenging him, but by refusing to acknowledge the threat he thinks he is, by the end of the week. The locker room combination was changed. His login to the precinct server stopped working. At a briefing, his name wasn't on the schedule. When he raised his hand to ask a question, the lieutenant simply moved on, eyes grazing over him like a placeholder in an empty seat. It was not punishment. It was worse. It was erasure, not out of rage, not in protest, but in moral clarity, a collective, quiet refusal to participate in the myth of Dean Laskey's authority any longer. The town followed suit. The local diner, where he used to get a free slice of pie on Sundays, now handed him a check without eye contact. The barber shop that always held his spot now told him they were appointment only, even as the chairs sat empty, one by one. Familiar places stopped being familiar. Doors still opened, but nothing inside recognized him. No small talk, no nods, just the heavy, polite silence reserved for people who've been judged not in court, but in conscience. He wasn't fired. He wasn't sued. He wasn't even questioned. He was simply no longer welcome. The final blow came not in public, but in a private space he once called sanctuary. The precinct break room. Dean walked in late on a Wednesday to find the room already full, officers talking, laughing, passing around a tablet. When he entered, the laughter died instantly. Conversations scattered like startled birds. One officer, younger than most, held the tablet tightly to his chest as if shielding it from view. Dean stood frozen, unsure if he should demand to know what was happening or walk away. In the end, he did neither. He just stood there. No one told him to leave. No one needed to. The silence in the room was total, and in it, he finally understood he wasn't being punished. He was being remembered differently, and that, he realized, was irreversible. Somewhere in that moment, the shape of his life changed. The badge still hung on his belt. His gun was still in its holster. His car still parked in the employee lot. But those things no longer meant what they once did. They were relics, costumes, symbols without meaning. Because power, he now knew, doesn't live in weapons or titles. It lives in the space between people in respect, in recognition, in belief. And he had lost all three. He started walking through town differently after that. Not like an officer, not like a man with command, but like someone drifting through a life that had quietly moved on without him. Children no longer looked up when he passed. Store clerks didn't ask how his shift had gone. Strangers stared a little too long, then turned away, not out of fear, but out of a kind of discomfort reserved for those who had once believed themselves invincible and were now simply visible bare, stripped of uniformed myth. One afternoon, he sat in his parked cruiser, still officially his, watching the sidewalk he had once considered his jurisdiction. A group of teenagers passed by, laughing. One of them, a tall girl with braids and earbuds in, stopped briefly to look at him. Their eyes met. She didn't frown, she didn't smirk, she just looked. And in that look, he saw something terrifyingly familiar. The same silence Naomi Trent had given him. Not hatred, not fear, just judgment, clear, still, undeniable. It was the day Dean Laskey stopped wearing his badge in public. Not because he was ashamed, he wasn't ready to admit that yet, but because deep down, in the quiet corners of his mind he once thought were steel reinforced, he realized something unshakable. There are some truths so powerful. They do not scream to be heard. They simply stay. And once they stay, nothing around them can remain the same. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't post a farewell on social media. She didn't write a resignation letter laced with condemnation or leave a voicemail in some administrator's inbox explaining why it was time. Naomi Trent just left, quietly, deliberately, entirely. One morning, her classroom door at West Pine Elementary remained closed. The laminated sign with her name, Ms. Trent. Room 14 still hung beside it, curling slightly at the corners from years of sunlight. The chairs were still arranged in a semicircle. The sensory bins were still full, meticulously labeled. Her calming music playlist was still queued on the class computer. But the woman at the center of it all, the woman whose very silence could soften storms in the minds of children others had labeled unreachable, she was gone. And no one had seen her leave. There was no trace, No official record. Her school badge was placed on the principal's desk in a small white envelope unmarked, unsealed, no note. The principal, Mr. Garvey, opened it and froze. He understood, not intellectually, but in the marrow of his bones. Something sacred had finished its cycle, and like all sacred things, it did not demand explanation. It simply made itself absent so that others might feel the weight of its memory. Her resignation was never processed, not because it was forgotten, but because no one wanted to be the one to stamp a file that ended her presence. But her departure was not silence. It was an echo. In room 14, the students arrived that Monday morning, expecting Ms. Trent's usual soft greeting and the smell of lavender oil she kept on a cotton ball near the heater. But the room felt colder, empty, not in form, but in spirit. The substitute, a well-meaning young teacher with a bright smile, tried her best. But children, especially those who've learned to read silence better than sound, knew immediately something was missing. One child, Elijah, nonverbal, prone to sudden bursts of panic, climbed into Ms. Trent's chair and just sat there, still, watching the door, as if waiting for her to walk through it and make everything make sense again. She didn't, and the class didn't cry. They just left a chair empty, every day, on purpose, not out of superstition, not even out of grief, but because children understand things that adults try to overwrite with logic. They understood that some presences cannot be replaced. They can only be honored by not filling the space they leave behind. At the district board, whispers started to circulate. Not rumors, reverence. Someone pulled Naomi's employment file again and stared at the blank sections with new eyes. She had never asked for a raise, never taken a personal day. Her feedback forms were perfect. Students improved. Parents felt safe. Colleagues called her a godsend. Yet, despite her track record, despite her legacy, no one knew where she had come from, and now no one could trace where she had gone. Meanwhile, far away from Stonefield, in a windowless training facility for federal agents, a quiet moment unfolded. A new crop of recruits, young, eager. Some naive sat through a mandatory seminar on de-escalation and social integrity. The lights dimmed. The projector buzzed to life. No title card. Just an image: Naomi Trent, walking down a sidewalk, her back to the camera, the sun casting a long shadow ahead of her like a path no one else could follow. Beneath the image, one line: she said nothing. That's why we listened. No voiceover, no statistics, no case breakdown. The room stayed silent for 10 full seconds. One recruit raised a hand to ask who she was. The instructor simply said, "That's not the right question." In the following weeks, the Trent effect rippled outward in ways even Naomi herself could not have predicted. Educators across the country began revisiting the way they handled student behavior. What would Naomi do became an unspoken mantra in teacher lounges and IEP meetings, not because she was a celebrity, but because her story had become a threshold, a moment everyone remembered stepping over, even if they didn't remember the details. And that's what made it powerful. She didn't speak into microphones. She didn't organize rallies. She became a standard, the kind of moral reference point that systems pretend not to need, until the absence of such a presence throws them into disarray. In Washington, policy advisors passed around internal slides about psychological destabilization through passive presence. They didn't name Naomi directly, but they all knew. The ripple of her silence had reached too far, too deep. One internal email warned about future operatives exerting systemic influence through narrative vacuum. which was code for "this woman said nothing," and still shattered our frameworks. A line in a Department of Justice briefing was later leaked. "We do not currently possess containment protocols for figures like PHX-7. In Stonefield." The echoes became more intimate. The bench Naomi used to sit on during lunch was left untouched. Not out of reverence, but recognition. A janitor started placing a small lavender sachet beneath it. Every Friday, no one knew who told him to. A teacher at the school left Naomi's favorite brand of tea in the staff kitchen, unopened. A mother whose child once cried every morning before school now found herself watching that child walk calmly through the gates each day. Glance once toward room 14 and smile briefly, quietly. The blog. The woman who didn't need to speak. Posted its final entry 1 month after Naomi's disappearance. It contained no text, no explanation, just a single audio file. It was 37 seconds long. In it, a child could be heard saying, "Ms. Trent said sometimes the quiet people are the ones who hear the most." That was it. The post garnered 5 million listens. No one commented. There was nothing left to say. Naomi's absence wasn't a void. It was a presence in negative space. A sculpted absence. Like the place someone leaves empty at a dinner table, not out of mourning, but gratitude. Her impact didn't burn. It resonated, like a tuning fork held against the architecture of a place, until every wall began to hum with a frequency they didn't know they could carry. Dean Laskey never spoke her name again, not because he'd forgotten, but because every time he heard silence in a room, he thought of her. He thought of the look she gave him, not defiant, not broken, but final. The kind of look that doesn't accuse, but reveals. The kind of look that doesn't wound, but shows you your own bruises and dares you to look away. Eventually, the town stopped asking where she had gone, not because they didn't want her back, but because they had come to understand something deeper. Naomi Trent was never here to stay. She was here to remind them of who they were when they were being watched by someone who expected better. In room 14 years later. A new teacher took the role. Kind, competent, well-loved, but the children still left one chair open during morning circle. They didn't talk about it. They didn't ask for permission. It wasn't superstition or habit. It was legacy. And legacies like Naomi's don't fade. They echo quietly, steadily reminding the world what it means to listen. Not to noise, but to presence. It began as a whisper between notebook pages, one student's reflection, jotted down during a quiet journaling exercise at West Pine Elementary. Months after Ms. Trent's disappearance, the class had moved on, as children are made to do, shuffled into routines, assessments, school picture days. The new teacher, patient and kind, had gently invited them to write about someone who made them feel safe. Most responses were short. My dad, my sister, my dog. But one entry had no name, no drawings, no date. Just a single line in the careful, rounded handwriting of a child learning to trust the shape of their own voice. She never asked to be heard. She just made silence feel like truth. The teacher didn't mark it with a star. She didn't correct the grammar. She just paused, hand hovering over the page, and then turned off the desk lamp. Something in her knew this line wasn't meant to be graded. It was meant to be kept. By that afternoon, the sentence had been photographed, printed, emailed, and by some digital alchemy that no one could trace. Shared tens of thousands of times. First by educators, then by counselors, then by people who didn't know Naomi Trent, but recognized the truth in that line, the ache of being silenced. the dignity of being still, the quiet that doesn't beg to be loud, but demands to be seen within days. The sentence had made its way into the margins of training manuals, the footers of internal memos, the intros of think pieces. A journalist used it to open an op-ed in The Atlantic. A senator quoted it in a closed-door ethics meeting, and though it never made the transcript, everyone in the room remembered it. Not because it was clever, but because no one could argue with it. That sentence didn't scream injustice, it didn't demand accountability. It did something worse to those in power. It held up a mirror and didn't blink. And that was the final, invisible shift. No law was overturned, no policy renamed, no executive order signed in her honor. Naomi Trent's name didn't appear on courthouse steps or national headlines. There were no marches in her memory, no placards bearing her image, no echoing chants, because that was never the shape of her power. Naomi had not come to be mythologized. She came to remind, and once reminded, the system could no longer pretend not to know itself. There was no explosion, no reckoning that tore institutions to pieces, but the system bent not from pressure, but from recognition. It bent in small ways. The kinds of ways that bureaucracies fear most, not loud opposition, but quiet rejection. A precinct in Baton Rouge canceled a controversial training contract without explanation. A school district in Colorado implemented a new nonverbal trauma response policy, citing only a shift in collective awareness. A mayor in Oregon resigned early, citing a loss of trust that feels larger than a mistake. But none of these were traced back to Naomi by name, because Naomi wasn't a headline. She was a threshold. After her, people started saying listen differently, not as a command, as a plea. Teachers paused longer before reprimanding a child. Officers hesitated just slightly longer before raising their voices. Administrators read evaluations with new eyes, searching not for red flags, but for what had been left unsaid. Not everyone changed. Not everything improved. But the excuses began to rot. And that alone was revolution enough. In Washington, during a closed seminar at a federal leadership retreat, a veteran intelligence consultant presented a case study titled simply PHX-7. No context, no full name, just the image of a woman walking away from a courthouse, her figure shrinking against the concrete, light trailing behind her like a ribbon of something untouchable. He said nothing for a full minute. Then, if your systems depend on noise to survive, they will not survive the people who've learned to win through silence. The room did not applaud, but no one forgot the slide. Back in Stonefield, small shifts unfolded without ceremony. The school where Naomi had taught quietly revised its disciplinary protocol. The calm room was renamed the Trent Room, not by committee, but because that's what the children started calling it, and no one had the heart or the arrogance to correct them. The town's library added a sensory reading corner inspired by Naomi's old classroom setup. No plaque, just peace. The bench Naomi once sat on remained untouched. The lavender sachets kept coming, on Wednesdays. Someone left a folded sheet of white paper beneath the bench, always blank. No one knew who started it. But those blank pages said everything that needed saying. Presence was not always visible. Impact was not always loud. Laskey was never reinstated, never fired, never mentioned. He moved 3 counties away and took up work as a private security consultant. But something about him had changed. Those who interacted with him spoke of a man who looked over his shoulder too often, who spoke too slowly, as if measuring every word for echoes that only he could hear. At night, He sometimes dreamed of a street so quiet. The asphalt hummed, and of a woman standing still at its center, not accusing him, not punishing him, just watching, for Naomi. There were no parades, no return. She had made herself a ghost by design, not to haunt, but to unburden. She had seen what systems did to people like her when they demanded to be heard, so she chose instead to show them what it felt like to be understood deeply, irrevocably, without translation. And the system did understand. It understood that it had trained its people to fear anger, but not grace, that it could suppress noise, but not silence, that it could rewrite stories, but not erase the memory of being seen by someone who expected it to be better. Naomi had not fought them. She had simply refused to flinch, and in that refusal, she unraveled the mythology of authority one gaze at a time. Years later, in a graduate seminar on educational justice, a student pulled out a grainy printout of Naomi's photo, the one taken the day Officer Laskey struck her. It had faded from the news, long replaced by newer tragedies, newer distractions, but the image still held power. The student placed it on the table and said, "We spend all this time teaching voice, but maybe we should be teaching presence." No one argued, because they all knew. Naomi had never asked to be heard. She had simply made truth impossible to ignore. And, in the end, that was the most lasting reform of all. Not a new law, not a policy, but the irreversible shift in the hearts of those who saw her and could never again look away. In the quiet aftermath of Naomi Trent's story, her calm resistance, her dignified silence, her invisible presence that shook the visible world, we are left not only with awe, but with responsibility. Her legacy is not just about one woman, one town, or one incident. It's a mirror held up to a country that still struggles to listen unless someone screams. Naomi never screamed. She never demanded a podium, never held a sign, never raised a fist. And yet, her story reshaped how people think, how institutions react, and how silence itself can become the loudest verdict. That is the lesson America must carry forward. True change does not always roar. It often arrives quietly, on soft feet, in classrooms, courthouses, and sidewalk shadows, carried by people who refuse to be erased, even when they choose to disappear. Naomi taught us that integrity doesn't seek attention, it demands reflection. Her power was never in retaliation, it was in her refusal to conform to the narratives written for her. That is the lesson for every citizen watching this. You do not have to break the system to hold it accountable. You just have to be unshakably honest in its presence. Whether you're a teacher, a parent, a city council member, or a young person trying to find your place in a noisy world. Understand this. Your voice matters. Yes, but so does your stillness, your consistency, your refusal to let injustice pass unchecked. The Trent effect reminds us that systems built on fear, control, and apathy will not survive the gaze of those who choose not to look away. So ask yourself, what chair are you leaving empty in honor of the truth? What conversation are you starting, not with volume, but with value? Who are you listening to, not because they speak loudly, but because they carry wisdom that systems often ignore? Naomi's story calls us to remember that real change rarely begins with applause. It begins with discomfort, with the silent shifting of conscience, with the quiet courage to stand alone. It asks that we don't wait for hashtags or headlines to move us, but that we notice what the world is trying to show us before it shouts. So if this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, question, or feel seen, don't let that stop here. Hit that like button, not for vanity, but for visibility. Share this video with someone who needs to remember the power of presence. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling stories that matter. Stories that go deeper than headlines and sound bites, stories that make us feel. Stories that make us remember. And above all, take this story with you into your classrooms, your meetings, your conversations, into your silences, into your choices. Because Naomi's voice lives on, not in what she said, but in what you do next.